Good afternoon, Anthony. Today we're going to be chatting about termite mounds in the Kruger National Park. In particular, looking at the results from a paper that I published recently with colleagues in the journal Ecology and Evolution, and it's entitled Soil Geochemistry and Constraints of Tree Seedlings Immediately After Germination on Macrotermes termite mounds in the Kruger National Park. And what I was looking at here was soil nutrient concentrations on and off these enormous termite mounds in the Palabora and Skukuza area of the Kruger Park. Looking forward to the discussion.
Well, yes, I was privileged to be part of the fieldwork, and I have to say that that was one of the most interesting episodes I've ever spent in the field in my life. Even though I've spent considerable time in places like the Serengeti and the exotic coast opposite Zanzibar, and I've been around South Africa in my time. But that little ecosystem just east of Palabora, between Palabora and some old indigenous copper mines in the granodiorite belt of the Kruger National Park, was to me one of the most exciting experiences I've had with the natural world, because it was so obvious that something really interesting was going on in terms of ecosystem engineering in a kind of a strange collaboration between this spectacular termite called Macrotermes, which builds these enormous mounds in Africa, and the largest land mammal, the African savanna elephant. These two animals were clearly co-engineering an ecosystem in a spectacular way that has never been explained, and before your study has never actually even been examined in the context of our discussion here.
Indeed. And I suppose, would you agree that the most interesting aspect of this is that there's a grassland within the savanna? These patches, these large termite mounds, are largely grassy, and if one looks from space, Google Earth, you can see images, these grassy patches in amongst a treed savanna. Is that the starting point for your interest?
Well, it's as good a starting point as any, and perhaps we can give listeners a little bit of a broad Pan-African context just to see how interesting this is. Across the central African woodlands and savannas that are both north of the equator and south of the equator in places like Zambia, there's a pattern in which the Miombo woodland is the matrix, and then dotted through the Miombo woodland there are large termite mounds covered in small patches of forest, dense forest, rainforest type forest, perhaps, 20 meters diameter, that kind of range, maybe 30, 40 in some cases, enough to support a nice little patch of nice green trees in the otherwise savanna-like Miombo ecosystem. And those mounds are big enough that the fires that sweep through the Miombo matrix every year don't actually encroach on the forest on the termite mounds. And so you've got, as you've said, two ecosystems in one in the Miombo. You've got a woodland or a savanna in the matrix, and then you've got these patches of forest species or evergreen species, very much woody plant dominated, almost to the exclusion of grass, on the mounds. Now, in our experience at Palabora, we found exactly the opposite, because the matrix there was the savanna again, but the termite mounds themselves were grassland. Perhaps it's misleading to call them grassland because that implies a biome. It wasn't a biome of grassland; it was just patches of treeless, grassy vegetation. So maybe we can call them grassy patches. Grassy patches. So what's odd is that in one ecosystem, the Central African Miombo, we have the same genus of termites, Macrotermes, producing a mound big enough to create a little patch of forest, fire-free forest, And by contrast, in the Palabora area of the Kruger National Park, mounds of considerable size instead eliminate trees and shrubs and produce unusually grassy conditions in the context of the bushveld of the Kruger Park. And that seems somewhat counterintuitive, and was one of several reasons why we were so intrigued to go there and sample the soils and see what was going on.
Why would you say it's counterintuitive? Just counterintuitive because elsewhere termite mounds seem to promote a mini forest on the mound.
Yes, I mean, the Miombo woodlands and the savannas of the Kruger Park are roughly comparable. They're mesic systems, with moderate rainfall. They're both tropicalish. I mean, Palabora is, I think, just south of the tropic line, but it's still in the region of the tropics. And the same genus of termite, Macrotermes, is operating in both cases, making these large mounds by excavating soil and going down to the groundwater table and picking up all kinds of nutrients, mysterious and intriguing nutrients, and then kind of enriching the soil surface with clay and nutrients in the form of its enormous mounds. But the vegetation responds in very different ways in the Miombo versus the Kruger Park bushveld, because in the former, trees and shrubs are promoted to the exclusion of grass almost, and in the latter, it's the other way around. So that does seem odd.
And the word patch could be misleading, because these patches can be 50, 100 meters across in this system, where the trees are excluded. So it's quite a large chunk of treeless area in amongst this treed savanna. But it reminds me of large mounds that we saw together at Nailsflay, just north of Pretoria, and also in the Caprivi strip in Namibia, that also had forest vegetation on them. And so would you agree that by and large across the Africa where Macrotermes mounds occur, in your experience, it tends to promote woody vegetation, the termites promote woody vegetation when these mounds are very large?
Yes, I would agree with that. I think most ecologists who have experience of large mounds of termites in Africa would agree with this, that not only is the cover of woody plants greater on the mound than off it, but you tend to get certain kinds of woody plants only on the mounds. The sorts of genera and species that tend to favor relatively rich soils or relatively dry climates. So, I mean, it's true even within the Kruger Park, because you and I later visited parts of the Kruger Park where you get large trees like Diosporus mispiliformis growing on large termite mounds. So even within the Kruger Park, you've got situations where the same genus Macrotermes makes mounds that tend to attract forest trees like Diosporus mispiliformis, and then a short way away you get these systems like the one we're talking about here, where comparable mounds instead kind of seem to shed trees, as it were. They seem to slough off any attempt by trees to colonize them. So we don't even need to go to the Miombo to find the fascinating contradiction. Just a 1 hour drive in the Kruger Park can take you from a situation where you have a forested mound to a situation where you have a grassed mound.
Yeah.
So what on earth is going on there?
And just for the reader's benefits, these large mounds were also in the Skakuza area, which is a good 4 or 5 hours drive at the speed limit of 40, 50 kilometers an hour in the Kruger. So a couple of 100 kilometers apart, there were the same mounds near Skakuza. And we sampled soils on the mounds and off the mounds, 20 mounds down at Skakuza, 20 mounds in Palabora, and reported on the soil nutrient concentrations on and off mounds at both these sites. So a total of 80 soil samples. And the long and short of the study is that we found that the mounds were enriched in most of the nutrients that we analyzed. And there was only one nutrient that was potentially problematic for plant growth on the mound. You know, if you look at the soil analyses through an agronomist's lens, an agronomist wanting to maximize plant growth in his or her field of any particular crop, the agronomist would be very concerned with the soils off the mounds in terms of the concentrations or amounts of phosphorus, calcium, copper, zinc, and boron. So the agronomist would be thinking, if I want to maximize my plant growth, I would need to fertilize. In all likelihood, I'm going to need to fertilize with phosphorus, calcium, copper, zinc, and boron. But if they were trying to grow the crops on the using the soil from the termite mounds, then the only nutrient that they would consider fertilizing would be boron.
Yes, well, that is
yeah. No, carry on.
That is a wonderful finding, and it kind of gels with what happens in the Miombo zone in several African countries, where the local people farm more or less only on the mounds.
Oh, right.
So what you'll often find is they've cleared the forest off a little mound, and then they plant their sorghum and other crops on the mound because the soils there are good enough to be worth cultivating. Whereas the Miombo matrix is left to the natural vegetation with a cycle of fire passing through it every year.
Right. And so now we need to try and explain why mounds that are rich in nutrients in the Miombo area and rich in nutrients, relatively speaking, in our Kruger Park sampling sites, why the one set of mounds attracts trees and the other set of mounds sheds trees. Is that the critical question at hand?
Well, it's one of the important questions. I think you could frame this from several different points of view, but we might as well go with that one. That's a difficult one to start with, but let's be challenging and go into that. And so you've documented the concentrations of these various nutrients in the topsoil. It seems certain that we can call the topsoil on the mounds nutrient rich, but we can also call the topsoil in the matrix in the savanna through which the mounds are dotted as kind of rather indifferent soil in most ways, not the kind of soil that would necessarily attract horticulture. Is that about right?
Correct. We can call it nutrient rich apart from the one element boron.
Correct, and that's it turns out actually to be the most intriguing and innovative aspect of your research, because this particular element boron, which is sort of differentially relatively poor on the mounds and relatively rich in the matrix at Palabora and Skukuza, turns out, according to your theory, to be crucial for explaining the presence or absence of woody plants.
Yes. The grasses have a lower requirement for boron compared with the woody plants, and so I'm invoking one of the reasons why grasses predominate on the mounds and the mounds shed the trees, as it were, is that the trees are relatively stunted on the mounds, constrained on the mounds compared with the grasses. And so in the Miombo woodlands and elsewhere in the Kruger, where trees are common on the mounds, I would hypothesize that there's there's sufficient boron on those mounds for the trees to be unconstrained by that element.
Now that becomes fascinating, and this is where one of the two major ecosystem engineers of the system comes in, because I think we would agree that a large part of the reason for the enrichment of the topsoil on the mounds is that Macrotermes, the spectacular mound-building termite of Africa and Asia, concentrates nutrients by its activities, by looking for clay in the surrounding landscape and then concentrating it in the mound to give the mound the right kind of durability for its purposes, and also digging remarkably deep. I think we've found references to the fact that Macrotermes in Namibia has been recorded burrowing down into the soil for 40 whole meters, whereupon it was discovered deep inside some cave system. Now, any termite that can go down 40 meters, the first question to ask is, what is it looking for there? Well, it may be looking just for groundwater, but you see groundwater often contains crucial concentrations of various trace elements and other nutrients. And so the incentive for the Macrotermes to burrow up to 40 meters deep, which is an astonishing depth for a little insect, really. It could be a combination of water and certain nutrients that it needs to fertilize its fungus culture, because Macrotermes makes a living not out of eating rubbish as other termites do, but out of feeding rubbish to a certain commensal or mutualistic fungus culture, and it then eats the fungus. So then the question arises, well, if these Macrotermes termites on the big mounds at Palabora and Skukuza were digging down and bringing up leached nutrients and concentrating them on the surface, making the mounds fertile for grass growth, why was it not the case that they were also bringing up boron? Because, as you said, it seems like they're bringing up boron in the Miombo zone. So what is it about this landscape in our study areas in the Kruger Park that enabled the Macrotermes to enrich all of the elements except boron? Such that, yeah.
Sorry, just to interject there on the enrichment. There was still an enrichment, but despite the enrichment, the boron concentrations on the mound were still suboptimal for plant growth, tree growth in particular.
Okay, well that makes a bit more sense. So let's review this, because it might be confusing for readers. Okay, so let's talk about the matrix and let's talk about the mound. The matrix is the sort of fairly stunted savanna in which the mounds are dotted, and the mounds are, these eminences in the landscape that are perhaps 10, 20 meters diameter on average.
Yeah.
Okay, and what you've got is Macrotermes burrowing down under the mound, retrieving all sorts of things for any number of meters down into the subsoil and even down to the groundwater, bringing up various nutrients and bringing up some boron, but in the process creating a differential in the ratio so that they're enriching the other elements, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, manganese, and so on, and copper particularly, more than they're enriching boron. And so what happens is that even though boron is somewhat being enriched, the ratio of boron to other nutrients is reduced relative to the matrix. And your idea, as I understand it, is that ratio is more important than the actual numbers. And so even though the mound has more boron than the matrix winds up manifesting boron more in its tree growth, because the ratio of boron to, say, copper is more suited to trees in the matrix than on the mound. And here it may be important to point out that this granite diorite belt at Palabora is well known to be copper rich at depth, because even before Europeans entered that area, there was a long history of indigenous copper mining there, just to get the metal for metallurgy in the original Bantu culture. So copper is pretty important, and the fact that the termites were enriching the mounds with copper helps to create a situation where the boron to copper ratio is reduced on the mound relative to the matrix. Is that correct?
Yes. I think ratios are one appropriate lens through which to look at this pattern. And I'm just reviewing my graphs here. Just the details are perhaps important here, so I'll just quickly run through which elements showed considerable enrichment and which elements didn't. So phosphorus, considerably enriched, calcium, magnesium, manganese, copper, zinc, boron, sodium, all considerably enriched, and the pH considerably greater as well on the mounds. Interestingly, potassium and sulfur did not show any enrichment. Now, it may well be that it's the ratios that are important, as you mentioned, but another possible way of looking at this, Anthony, is in the matrix, the power of the grasses is just considerably reduced because they are constrained by the amount of phosphorus, zinc, and copper, and boron. Even boron, yes, probably boron even for the grasses. So the grasses are constrained by copper, zinc, boron, phosphorus in the matrix, and are less powerful foes than they are on the mound. On the mound, the power of grasses is extreme as a result of that boosted fertility. Whether that's because the ratios have changed or just the fact that they're now unconstrained organisms, those grasses. There is no element constraining them, and as a result, the trees really battle to deal with the grass competition on the mounds. But off the mounds in the matrix, the grasses are just these weak entities, and trees are able to prevail as a result.
Yes, I understand. Okay, so let me put it in slightly different words. In both situations, the matrix and the mound, you've got competition between grasses and woody plants. We can call them trees. And one of the main trees on the mounds was Combretum apiculatum. I think it's called the red bush willow. Is that right?
Yeah.
And that tree had often been visibly mangled by the elephant, the African savanna elephant, and it was often found sort of lying on its side, having been felled by the elephant, but insisting on pushing up vertical shoots in some valiant evolutionarily modified attempt to survive that battery of the ecosystem engineer that we call the elephant in Africa. But anyway, this competition.
Sorry to interrupt you. You said those trees were on the mounds. Those trees are predominantly off the mounds.
Yes, the trees are predominantly off the mounds, but there were some valiant survivors even on the mounds, as if resisting complete annihilation waged on them by the elephant.
Sure.
Because off the mounds that mangling was not quite so obvious, but the mounds, even though the Combretum apiculatum was scarce on the mounds, it was instrumental or instructive in the sense that it showed just how powerful the brute force of the elephant is in its capacity as an ecosystem engineer, assisting grasses, as it were. You see, we're going to talk more about the raw competition between the grasses and the woody plants, but there's more to it than that, because the elephants are assisting the grasses in the sense that they're breaking everything down, but the grasses can recover from that breakage more rapidly than the bush willow and the other woody plants can. But coming back to your basic idea here. Okay, so the various nutrients promote grass growth. And the only thing that can constrain grass growth is a shortage of those nutrients. So Those nutrients are not themselves constraining the grass growth, but a shortage of them is constraining the grass growth. And as you've pointed out, because there's less shortage on the mound than off the mound, grass is more promoted on the mound than off the mound. But you see, the trouble with that, Anthony, is that that should theoretically also apply to the woody plants. That's the first thing that, a listener will ask is, well, fine, yes, the grasses are growing better on a fertile mound than on a less fertile matrix, but surely the same is going to be true for the woody plants. Surely the various trees and shrubs that are present in the matrix have counterparts on the mound that could potentially be capitalizing on the fertility of that mound and growing so vigorously that they outcompete the grasses. So the differential fertility of the matrix versus the mound is only one part of an explanation that must introduce some other factor that tips the competitive balance towards the grasses on the mounds and away from the grasses in the matrix.
Yeah, and what I invoke in this paper is that even though there's enrichment of boron on the mounds, that enrichment is not sufficient for trees to, exert their maximal competitive strength.
Yes, well, that goes by Liebig's law of the minimum. In other words, the trees are getting more boron on the mound, but because there's so much more copper, phosphorus, and manganese and magnesium, the demand for the boron is greater. And so essentially what we're saying is that trees always demand boron. And where trees could potentially grow faster on the mound because everything is more fertile on the mound, they suffer a shortfall in the boron, which then limits them. The shortage limits them, and then the grasses don't have that limitation, and so the woody plants get outcompeted by the grasses. And then that attracts intense herbivory, not only by the African savanna elephant, but by various other herbivores, including the impala. And the dunging cycle, the trampling and the dunging and the peeing and the whole nutrient cycling by the various herbivores further fertilizes the system in the sense of recycling the nutrients rapidly through decomposition. And so you have essentially what you've got on these mounds that dot the matrix of the savanna, these grassy mounds, is a sort of almost like a little farm system going where, you've got all the elements of a rich pasture. You've got the fertility and the dunging and peeing and trampling cycle, all of which promote grasses at the expense of woody plants. And so you've got these little, almost agronomic little patches going. And all of this is created initially by the termite. The termite is the original ecosystem engineer because it goes down in the soil deep enough and also sideways in its quest for clay particles so that it can make a little farmable patch in which the forces of leaching have been reversed and the generally fairly sandy soils have been made into something more clay-like. And so it's almost like these ecosystem engineers called Macrotermes have created a little mounded patch of farm soil that then is exploited by herbivores, making it even more farmed naturally, as it were. And as everyone knows that, if you have such intense activity on a pasture, it's very unlikely that woody plants are going to be able to crowd out both the grasses and all of the animals that eat the grasses. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's a good way of framing it. And another term that jumps to mind is a grazing lawn has been created.
Well, yes, there were actual some lawnish elements, but I think when we were in the field, we noticed not so much grazing lawns as just swords of grass that were nutritious enough that in the dry season, even after the above ground parts of the grass dry out, it's still relatively nutritious hay as opposed to worthless straw. Did we find a lot of actual lawn species like cynodon on those mounds, or was it more just mainly shortish grasses?
When we sampled, it was in the dry season, and so as you said, the grass was hayish, dry hay. Later in other trips, I was there in the rainy season, and you can see in the paper there some pictures of grass, covered green grass across the mounds. In figure 1B, if you have the paper in front of you, it's completely covered in grass. It's 100% grass cover, and as I recall, that's often a Eurocloa species, and there is a creeping aspect to that grass. So I think it certainly looks like a grazing lawn, or they can look like grazing lawns in the summer, whereas when we were sampling them, there was a lot of bare soil because the grass had died off in the winter.
Yes, well, even without being too precise about how we define a grazing lawn, it's directionally correct in the sense that what you've got is a sward of grass being maintained short and sweet and productive by intense herbivory, probably by anything up to 10 different herbivores, ranging from the steenbok up through the impala, and the African savanna buffalo, and the
white rhino is a big player.
White rhino, indeed,
Yeah.
very big player, and also the zebra of that region. So you've got a whole bunch, at least half a dozen important herbivores that are all congregating on those mounds and chowing down and keeping the grass short, sweet, and productive in the green season. Enough of it survives at the end of the green season that it can still sometimes carry a fire, but the fire is really incidental in the system. It's really a herbivore-run system on those patches.
Yeah. And of course, intensely puzzling as to why one can drive, as you say, 30 minutes to an hour away from these sites, and then you find trees growing out of the Macrotermes mounds. But that's a puzzle for another day, in that I haven't sampled those mounds. I would very much like to understand why. There's in essence a thicket or a forest on mounds nearby. But
I suspect the following applies. You see, I'm picking on the Palabora area because that's where the copper mine was nearby, and it was a really spectacular example of a landscape almost formed by the termite in the sense that there was this ridge conspicuously dotted with these mounds. It almost looked like some kind of ancient civilization, more spectacular than the Skukuza area. See, the difference is that Palabora ridge covered in these large grassy termite mounds was an upland within the relatively flat katina of the Kruger Park, whereas in my experience, many of the mounds that are covered in little patches of forest, particularly Diospris mespiliformis, tend to be more on the plains or even adjacent to drainage lines. And because boron is a very, very soluble, easily drained element that tends to accumulate in groundwater, it could be that no amount of digging beneath the topsoil of the ridge at Palabora gave the Macrotermes an opportunity, particularly to enrich boron, because they never really hit the kind of groundwater that is a source of concentrated boron, whereas in other landscapes in the Kruger Park, it could be that the groundwater that they hit in relative bottomlands gives them enrichment not only in most of the nutrients we've been discussing, but also boron, to the degree that the requirements of woody plants in competition with grasses is met. And so the woody plants in those situations have enough boron to snarf up all of the copper and calcium and phosphorus, and also to make their woody tissues, which is a metabolic function that actually has a specific requirement for boron, which strengthens the whole, the cell wall and cement mechanism of the woody plant.
Certainly, that may well be the case, and However, I think we do need to contemplate a fertile soil in the Kruger Park with no particular nutrient causing any plant constraint. We would hypothesize in that situation that grasses would in all likelihood still be highly competitive. A highly fertile soil with no nutrient deficiencies, grasses would be extremely competitive, and in all likelihood you'd end up with a grassland.
Yeah, well, that's that assertion that you've just made really warrants lingering on for a bit, because it's very nicely supported at the level of the biomes of the world, but it is something that most ecologists are going to object to as a kind of a knee reflex. Okay, so let's look at both of those things. If you look at the big steppe belts or prairie belts or grassland belts of the world, they're all basically on rich soil. The loess in various parts of the northern hemisphere, the loess that constitutes the pampas in Buenos Aires province in South America. The Ukraine is a perfect example. I mean, Ukraine is famous for its fertility, and it was originally a treeless grassland called the Eurasian steppe. The short grass prairies in North America, rich soils, wonderfully productive if watered. And so the big grassland belts of the world are generally found on rich soils. But you see, where most ecologists balk is to interpret that as a kind of a competitive outcome in which the fertility has empowered grasses to the point of actually being able to take on woody plants and exclude them. So most ecologists would agree that the prairie belts of the world, the treeless grassland belts of the world, are generally rich soils, but they would regard that as more like a coincidence. Because what we're saying is the richness actually causes the grass to exclude the woody plants, whereas most ecologists would balk and they would say, no, that's far-fetched. Clearly a woody plant, which can overshadow and shade and, physically dominate the smaller plant that we call a grass, is going to prevail if conditions are both fertile and well watered. And so the only mechanism whereby the grass could fight back is through fire, for example. But we're saying that there's something much more fundamental and something much more counterintuitive, which is that if you take an ecosystem and you give it lots of everything, including water, lots of phosphorus, lots of calcium and copper and everything, a bit like an agriculturally enriched soil, and you water it well, and you just let the natural indigenous plants fight it out, particularly the category called herbaceous plants such as grasses and the category called woody plants such as shrubs and trees, then counterintuitively what you'll actually get is a grassland, simply because grasses are the more demanding creatures, and although they don't build up biomass in the way that savanna and forest trees do, they turn over biomass at a furious rate. And so when you look at the grassland dynamically, it minimizes biomass precisely because it's maximizing productivity. And the demand of that productivity basically snatches the resources out from under the roots of the trees and basically outcompetes the trees in a potentially quite simple way that is very counterintuitive. And I don't think 1 in 10 ecologists actually would agree with us that this is an accepted process or principle in ecology.
Agreed. And but there is perhaps a way of framing it so that it's more palatable, and that is, would you agree that it's when the tree is a really small organism that immediately after germination that the power of the grasses is most relevant, because a dense, powerful grass sward, not limited by nutrients, can easily overpower a little germinating tree that's just emerged from the seed. That's easy to comprehend. So you don't need to think about how grasses are overcoming large organisms. You can actually think about it as grasses overcoming a very small organism, a tree seedling that's just popped out of its seed.
Yes. Well, that's right. Say, for example, in the Pampas ecosystem of Buenos Aires province in Argentina, where you have no large herbivores to speak of. I mean, the biggest herbivore there is a deer about the size of a mountain reedbuck, about 30 kilograms, and not in large numbers. So there are plenty of rodents, of course, but you don't have any big equivalents of, for example, elephant, buffalo, and rhino, and so on. And so that's a relatively simple system to study, in the sense that it's really just a kind of a raw competition along the lines that you've outlined between grasses and the seedlings of woody plants. And so viewed through that prism, yes, it's quite conceivable that the poor little tree seedlings can never really get a start in life, because at that stage, that crucial stage of their life history, they're just so vulnerable that competing with like-sized grasses, if a few inches high, they just can't cut it. Because you see, what the woody plant is trying to do is it's trying to accumulate woody tissues to the point that it can get its root down and get some sort of water or nutritional advantage over the grass, and to get its woody stem high enough that it can start to shade out the grass. But before it can muster those resources, it's snuffed out, because it's not as efficient a converter. The reason why the woody seedling is not as efficient a converter or an allocator of resources as the grass is that it's trying to make an infrastructure in the form of a ligneous stem that the grass is not trying to do.
Yeah.
And so the grass has the advantage because it's not going for infrastructure, it's just going for dynamic power. And so if you compare, a sward 50 centimeters high of Eurocloa, a very productive and palatable and nutritious grass, with a series of Combretum seedlings, also 50 centimeters high, that are just battling it out for supremacy, it is, as you say, quite easy to see that the grasses can just frankly win at that stage, excluding most of the woody plants. Some woody plants might survive, but then they get hammered by the elephants. And even Macrotermes, the ecosystem engineer termite that is in the system, is known to eat up woody plants in some situations. It just basically chows them.
Yeah.
In fact, Macrotermes is a big pest in horticulture in both Asia and Africa, because if you plant a shamba in somewhere like Zambia, the Macrotermes can come in and just eat everything. They actually do that. Yeah.
Great. So, but just returning to the mounds that are that have trees on them in the Kruger Park, near to these the Palabora and Skukuza sites that we sampled, you're invoking. You suggested that perhaps those mounds have a greater quantity of boron on them, thereby enabling the trees to prevail. My immediate thought there is that, well, if there's sufficient boron on those mounds, then there's going to be sufficient amounts of all other nutrients as well. And I would predict, based on our discussion over the last 10 minutes, that would also be a grassland. So I think it's perhaps more likely that those mounds are less enriched than the Skukuza and Palabora mounds, enabling the trees to prevail because the grasses are less powerful than on the Palabora and Skukuza mounds.
Yes, well, the two explanations are not mutually exclusive. So the way I would put it is as follows. If you go down to a relatively low-lying place in the Kruger Park, somewhere close to a drainage line, and you find a big mound covered in Diospyros mespiliformis and other evergreen trees, then maybe what the Macrotermes termites are doing is they're digging down deep into the soil, maybe 20, 30 meters. They're bringing up water, clay, and various nutrients. But that substrate is not as rich as those Palabora substrates, which have a copper mine in them. So they're not actually bringing up that much phosphorus, copper, calcium, and so on. But they are, because the drainage in the landscape, they are bringing up considerable boron. And so they're not enriching the mound as much with the common or garden nutrients as at Palabora, but they are enriching it more in boron. And so they're shifting the ratio. There is a general enrichment, but whereas the ratio in Palabora is shifted against boron on the mounds, the ratio elsewhere in the park in low-lying areas is shifted towards boron on the mounds. And so that's not a mutually exclusive process with the one you're describing, because yes, there's just sheer competition going on at the level of the seedlings with the grass sward, but in those mounds, those low-lying mounds, there's enough boron in the soils to allow some seedlings to prevail and to get to the stage of establishing a woody infrastructure. And you see, it only takes one seedling on the whole mound to grow into a mature tree of Diospyros mespiliformis, basically to dominate the mound as a little forest patch. Because Diospyros mespiliformis, as you know, can get up to, I don't know, at least 20 meters high at a pinch, and has a crown wide enough to, essentially dominate the mound.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I look forward to carving out some time to go and sample those mounds to assess that. The one problem that one encounters with the sampling is that the trees themselves create a nutrient hotspot, because they're capturing nutrients in the canopy, and their roots are going down deep, probably deeper than the grasses, and so there's a fertilization happening over time by the trees as well, and so it becomes difficult to untangle the effects of the trees versus the termite.
Well, that's a fantastic point, and it raises the idea of a kind of how can I put it, a crucial threshold, such along the following lines. If the termites can just bring up a great enough ratio of boron to other nutrients to get the Diospyros mespiliformis to reach sapling stage, then the sapling stands to get its own roots down to the boron-rich zone. And once that happens, it no longer needs the enrichment process facilitated by the termites, and it can then wage its own war on the grasses based on its own self-enrichment in boron. And so it's a complex situation. But you see, what we're doing, while our hypothesizing is complex, we're still following certain principles that make sense. Principles of differential nutrition between woody plants and grasses. And that particular idea is way underplayed in the literature. In fact, it doesn't seem to actually be in the literature. This idea that the basic process of competition between woody plants and grasses has to do with differential regimes of nutrients, in the sense of nutrient ratio profiles. So that the kind of nutritional regime in the soil that favors woody plants differs from that favoring grassy plants in terms of the actual ratios of nutrients, particularly the ratio of boron relative to other nutrients. So what we seem to have in the Kruger Park, subject to testing, is a situation in Palabora where on a copper-rich landscape, but one quite remote from the water table, you get differential enrichment in copper and other nutrients without particular enrichment in boron, whereas elsewhere in the park you get only modest enrichment in copper and other nutrients, but particular enrichment with boron, which is enough that a seedling of something like Diospyros can bust through a certain threshold whereupon it can amplify its own sufficiency and establish itself basically permanently on the mound at the expense of the grasses. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. And as you were speaking, I was thinking how most ecologists would view differences in vegetation structure across the Kruger National Park. They'd view it through lenses of herbivory and fire. Would you agree? The ratios of different nutrients just do not come into the discussion, in my experience.
Well, that is correct. That is correct. And there's nothing wrong with invoking herbivory and fire. Fire is usually invoked more than herbivory, maybe because it's a simpler thing to envisage and to study. And there's nothing wrong with that. But you see, the basic problem with those mechanisms is that they are mechanistic. And as students of cause and effect, which is the ultimate goal in science, as it were, there's a difference between mechanism and cause. Now, cause is always very difficult to establish in science. It's almost like a mirage that recedes the closer you get to it. But I think most people would agree that the availability of fundamental resources, like nutrient elements, which cannot be fabricated, they have to be found.
Yep.
That availability is closer to cause than something like fire, which is itself an epiphenomenon of the ecosystem itself. And so how an ecosystem burns or does not burn depends on the biological properties of that ecosystem in terms of providing fuel, providing ignition events, and so on. So fire can never be ultimate cause because it only exists to the degree that the biological entities present allow it to exist. The same with herbivory. So herbivory and fire are mechanisms, perhaps extremely important mechanisms, perhaps complex, intriguing, and counterintuitive mechanisms, well worthy of study. But nutrients are closer to cause because they're not just mechanistic, they are actually fundamental resource requirements. And so perhaps the most important principle we're invoking, and perhaps the most surprising to ecologists, is that we are invoking a fundamental causal hypothesis in nature whereby if you happen to have a rich soil, rich across the board of nutrients, albeit not particularly rich in boron, you will tend spontaneously and naturally, regardless of the mechanisms of fire and herbivory, to get a grassland that excludes trees. That is a powerful, powerful idea that's completely new in the ecological literature. So that's worth saying again. Just give me any landscape in the world where the soil is naturally rich for whatever reason, a bit like a fertilized field in a farm. And you've got lots of all of the general nutrients, phosphorus, manganese, copper, calcium, potassium, blah, blah, blah. And you just let nature take its course. You allow any species that's indigenous to the area to fight it out on that patch. And what will, according to us, will tend to happen if the soil is rich enough in a wide variety of nutrients is that the trees will not manifest their power. They will somehow manage to be subdued by the grasses, largely at the seedling stage, as you've just said, but also by various other mechanisms depending on the situation. And so you'll get the most counterintuitive possible thing, which is that the kind of soil that enables metabolic power to be maximized also minimizes biomass. So fertility that maximizes the metabolic activity of plants on the site, the photosynthetic rate, the rate of generation of protein, and all these kinds of things, the recycling rate, that will tend to create, in some cases, a vegetation that almost seems bare in the dry season, which is deeply counterintuitive. But it's actually in line with our agricultural experience, because if you think of a fertilized farm, then there is generally not much vegetation on it in terms of standing biomass. And at a certain time, the fallow time, the soil is actually bare. And yet that is the most productive ecosystem that we humans have been able to create in order to feed our vast population. So what we're doing is we're taking that well-recognized but poorly enunciated agricultural phenomenon of huge fertility but minimum biomass, and we're saying it doesn't need human mechanisms to perpetuate that. You can actually get that in a prairie, because there's enough going on in a prairie that you get basically the same effect. Give me fertility, I'll give you an absence of trees by virtue of a ferocious activity of grasses. And this actually it corresponds with a sort of complementary mind boggle in the form of rainforest, because most people who are uninitiated in terms of nutrition and natural resources might assume that a lush rainforest is growing on a rich soil. Whereas everybody who's studied rainforests knows that in general exactly the opposite is true. You show me a big, luxuriant, tall, dense rainforest, I'll show you a dirt poor soil.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's counterintuitive, but not far-fetched.
No, absolutely. And I think at the start of our podcast, we were talking about nutrients and herbivory and fire, but it perhaps would have been better to frame it right there as the nutrients being close, most likely being closer to the true cause than the mechanistic fire and herbivory. That distinction is a critical piece to get across when discussing vegetation structure and soils. Would you agree?
Yes. Yes, I suppose you could say that this study that you did in the Kruger Park was kind of, in a broad sense, a test of this idea that if you can find a really rich soil somewhere in nature that's just naturally rich without having been enriched by people, you should find grassy vegetation on it. But it's more complicated than that, because you have to explain in this particular situation why there are trees in the matrix. Because, it could be the case that both the matrix and the mound would have just grassland, albeit for the grassland on the mounds being more vigorous, more nutritious, more dynamic, more powerful. But there's something complicated in the sense that trees are actually prevailing in the matrix. So is that just because the matrix is not quite as rich? Or is it because there's some factor, in our case boron, that is actually promoting the woody plants, giving the woody plants a resource that they alone need? The grass doesn't need much boron because it's not trying to make lignin. But because the woody plant's survival depends upon that ligneous mechanism of growing tall enough to shade out the grasses and going deep enough to tap into the groundwater, that boron becomes the linchpin. And again, not in an absolute sense, but in the sense of its ratio to other elements such as phosphorus and copper.
Yeah. And I quite enjoy thinking about the savannas in the Kruger Park and the mounds at Palabora and Skukuza. In terms of the analogy that you just made with the pampas versus the rainforest, the mounds are the equivalent of the pampas, the rich system with the grasses prevailing, and the matrix is the equivalent of the rainforest with the trees prevailing, but the soils being nutrient poor.
That is correct. But the ecosystem engineers in the system in the Kruger Park are spectacular and cannot be left out of the picture.
Yeah, they've created the pampas, as it were.
Yes, it would be very misleading for us to propose that the soils in the Palabora area that naturally support grassland do so simply because they're naturally rich.
Right.
At very minimum, their natural richness has to be explained as having arisen by virtue of ecosystem engineers in the form of the termites.
Yes.
They're much more powerful than the word termite would imply to most listeners. Most listeners around the world, you tell them you're talking about a termite, they'll talk about, an animal that has some power, for example, to destroy buildings, but it's basically just a refuse eater. And because refuse is by definition a poor kind of a food, therefore the ecological power of termites is going to be assumed to be limited. But Macrotermes is a remarkably powerful creature in Africa. not only does it mine resources and bring them to the surface, and to some degree cut down vegetation, it also recycles dung, including the dung of elephants. It farms its own food in the form of a fungus culture to the degree that it never actually attempts to digest any rubbish, ligneous or fibrous rubbish itself. It always feeds the rubbish to the fungus culture and then eats the choice products of the fungus culture, living very high on the hog for a termite. It's engineering the whole system in a very deep and powerful way, and it has such a powerful culture that the fungus that grows deep within these termite mounds, when it produces actual mushrooms, produces spectacularly enormous mushrooms, the size of a dinner plate or bigger. That the local people rush in during the green season and snarf up and eat. It's not just some little mushroom; it's a perfectly spectacular mushroom. That is a kind of a testimony to yet another aspect of how perfectly spectacular the whole role of Macrotermes is in these African savannas. So you've got a spectacularly big termite that produces, through its termitomyces mutualist, big mushrooms, produces big mounds with big fertility, with big dynamism of grasses that attract big herbivores, the rhino, the elephant, the buffalo, and produces a big effect on the landscape in the sense of introducing grassy patches that you can see from the air in an otherwise woody plant dotted savanna. Everything about this is big, spectacular, intriguing, dynamic, and in terms of the ecosystem engineering function of termite and elephant, perfectly spectacular. And it's surprising that the system has not been intensely studied before you went in there and did your work.
No, agreed. And a thought experiment, Anthony. Just strip the mega herbivores, all the herbivores, and the Macrotermes out of the equation, and simply fertilize patches with nutrients such that you end up with the same geochemistry as that which we see in the mounds today. I wonder if it would be like a pampas or prairie system. Without, would the grasses still keep the trees at bay, or is it critical in this system? Are the mega herbivores and the termites damaging the tree seedlings? A critical part of the system, enabling these grassy patches to prevail?
Well, that's a fantastic question. That's a wonderful thought experiment. Whether it's practical as an actual experiment or not, I can't say. It sounds very complicated to set up, but my gut feeling would be that probably in a system as herbivore rich as the Kruger Park, all those different herbivores chowing all that grass, recycling all their urine, their dung, and even their bodily carcasses into that soil, so alter the regime of recycling that it must be crucial to producing the outcome that we see. It would boggle my mind to think that all that herbivore activity was just simply epiphenomenal and tangential to what actually happens. But it's possible. It's possible that if you were to remove all the elephants, all the other herbivores, and even the termites themselves, and just somehow artificially construct a mound of exactly the same physical properties and nutrient richness as we see in the field, and then just keep everything out of it, but allow all the propagules of the various competing plants to reach the site. Allow starlings to shit out seeds of Diospis mesiliformis and 20 other woody plants, and sprinkle all the natural grassy seeds, Eurocloa and Cynodon and Brachypogon and whatever, and just allow them to battle it out for, say, 2 decades on that artificially constructed mound. It would be truly fascinating to see what happens. And I can't really predict the outcome, but my gut feeling is that all those herbivores in one of the most herbivore-rich systems in the world, in terms of the range of body sizes, the number of coexisting herbivorous species, the sheer intensity of the herbivory in terms of population densities. It's hard for me to imagine that that's not part of the vital mechanism whereby these grassy patches are created and maintained.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. But taking the thought experiment even one step further, I think we would agree on the fact that give us any forest, any savanna in the world, we could create grassland patches in it through fertilization.
Now that's another. Okay, let's tease that out a bit. That's really fascinating. It's a real good focus that brings out the importance of mechanism. Yeah. Okay, so imagine you just take a nice dense woodland. Let's pick on a Miombo woodland in Central Africa, and you just basically rain fertilizer down on it. Now, a guy called Ray Specht, who I think has passed on now, but he was one of the earlier ecological experimenters in Australia, where he did this in nutrient-poor heathland ecosystems in South Australia. There's a vegetation called quongan, which is a bit like fynbos. It's a very nutrient-poor evergreen shrubland in Australia, fire-prone, almost like the epitome of a nutrient-poor ecosystem, dominated by woody plants, albeit only shrub-sized. And he did exactly this. He did a series of experiments in which he fertilized the site, after noticing that even things like cigarette butts and dog urine could create little patches of weedy infestation in this otherwise natural vegetation. So he spotted this corrupting effect, and so he did experiments. I think he just put phosphorus in. I don't think he put anything else. And what he observed is that initially, in like the first few years, the existing woody plants like Protea species, Banksias and so on, actually grew better for a while. They grew better for a while, so they responded to that phosphorus. But then they died earlier. They became senescent sooner. So they had a little splurge in the sun, which temporarily looked like they were becoming even stronger in competition with herbaceous plants. But then they toppled over because they couldn't sustain their whole economical and thrifty and frugal way of life was in some sense fundamentally poisoned by affluence in the form of artificially amended phosphorus. And so they collapsed. And after they collapsed, all these introduced weeds from the Mediterranean, annual grasses and, various weedy plants, daisies and so on, and it took over the site and permanently excluded the regeneration of the Banksias, thus corrupting the system fundamentally based on nothing more than just a somewhat enriched phosphorus regime, which is now actually buggering up a lot of the natural quongan-like vegetation in Australia, because there's now enough, inadvertent pollution of nutrients in these heathland systems that they are becoming terminally and permanently choked with weeds, which alters the whole fire regime and it alters everything. And it's a sorry mess to look at, but that indicates that that if you were to rain down nutrients experimentally on a woodland anywhere in the world, you might initially find the woodland plants flourishing, becoming denser, becoming taller, being metabolically and photosynthetically more active. And it might take decades or even centuries for that to play out, where those trees kind of run out of juice. Because they don't actually like this regime, but within the lifetime of a given individual, they can respond to it. And then it would take some kind of mechanistic process for them to be broken down, for their wood to be eliminated through fire or through chopping or through grinding, so then the land could be cleared. So another way to say this is that a woody community has tremendous inertia. And you can't just evaporate the woody infrastructure by raining nutrients on the site that then encourage the growth of herbaceous competitors, because you have a kind of a fait accompli in the sense that the site is cluttered up with wood. And so what a human being does, wanting to farm that site, is goes in with a ball and chain and tractors and all kinds of fossil fuel based mechanisms and gets rid of the trees. That's what the early settlers did in America. In Australia, they went in and just cleared wholesale in an almost obscene way the eucalyptus woodlands and shrublands, just basically removing the wood completely and burning it off.
Yeah.
They couldn't afford to wait just by, putting on phosphorus and waiting for the trees to die. It would never work. So, this is why biology is so complex, is because both cause and mechanism are important, and the mechanisms are fantastically complex. So maybe we'll never. Yeah.
Yeah, we may never know, but perhaps one could. The joy of thought experiments is one's not constrained. So I'll take the thought experiment one step further again and say, okay, let's give me any savanna or woodland or forest in the world. Give me a chainsaw, and I'll cut down all the trees in 1 hectare plots, 100 meters by 100 meters. Cut down, hundreds of these plots, and then one can theoretically fertilize those plots to a point where you've got a wonderful fertile soil equivalent to, say, the pampas. And I predict that we can maintain grasslands on those plots simply because the nutrition is such that those grasses weedy herbaceous plants are going to be extremely powerful and prevent the indigenous trees from reinvading those cut down plots.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that, and that makes the two of us mavericks in the field of our peers, because I don't think even 1 in 10 of our peers would agree with us based on a kind of a fundamental logic of cause and effect.
Yeah.
I think that this idea that grasses are actually more powerful than trees is a deeply, shall we say, how can I put it? It's a subversive notion in ecology. But if it's true, once it snaps into focus, a whole lot of things make sense in the world of biomes that don't actually make much sense otherwise, such as, for example, the Pampas in Argentina. The Pampas was a vast area of grassland under virtually ideal ecological conditions. Deep, extremely fertile soil, well watered in both the summer and the winter. Really perfect, and it's proven to be one of the best agricultural areas ever discovered by humans in the world. So it was almost like a paradise for plant growth. And yet, when the Spanish arrived in 1500, they found no trees on it for hundreds of miles in every direction.
Yeah.
What can explain that? This is South America. This is the continent of the Amazon. It's also the continent of the Atlantic forest in Brazil, just north of Argentina. And even if you just go slightly inland from the Pampas into the drier country in western Argentina, you start getting trees coming in. Not in wetter conditions, but in drier conditions. And so the Pampas is almost like a living example of this experiment. It's almost as if nature has done this. It's ultimately fertilized and watered a large plot of perfectly fertile soil derived from the settlings of the emissions of volcanoes far south in the Andean chain, wafted on the breeze to the Pampas and deposited in fantastic deposits of dust, tens of meters deep over a huge plain. And then the experiment has been done, and here you have a grassland that's so profoundly poor in woody plants that it's actually hard to compile a floristic list of the woody plants in the Pampas. That's how difficult it is.
So my thought experiment has largely been done. Fantastic.
Yes, but it would be very difficult to do in many situations, because you see, in many situations in the world that favor trees, you've got a profound leaching regime every rainy season, in which your fertilizer is going to get leached down into the water table. So you'd have to really pile on the fertilizer thick and deep, Yeah. And then you also have to ensure that your patch of cleared and fertilized land was small enough that a considerable rain of diaspores and propagules could continue to reach the site from the surrounding forest, making sure that you've got all the natural competitors that you need to have a genuine result. because that result would be most spectacular if it were the case that the grass is growing on this cleared patch, but there's a continual rain of 40, 50, 100 different species of trees and shrubs coming in there, borne by the wind or dropped by birds or whatever. And despite that army of woody propagules just fighting for that site, if you found that the grass just simply snuffed all that woody aspiration out, that would be really interesting to observe. I doubt whether anybody will ever get their shit together to do that experiment. But like you said, I think this is a best kept secret that we can share with listeners, is that there is an experimental and empirical aspect to all sciences, including biology, but there's also a realm of imagination that in its way is equally rewarding, because in some ways thought experiments are more exciting than reality, because they force the mind to inch towards clarity in terms of distinguishing cause from effect, in terms of being precise about the conceptual framework that you're dealing with, and so on.
Yeah.
So even if this is ultimately just pie in the sky and will never actually be enacted as an experiment, I think it's still worth going into and trying to think through.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Anthony. It's been a wonderful discussion. I think if I had the opportunity to rewrite this paper, I would certainly add some additional points into it. But such is life. When it comes to science, as soon as it's published, you can think of many things to insert into the paper to improve it. So thank you for taking this paper one step forward with me, or several steps forward. Thoroughly enjoyable, and look forward to continuing this discussion on grasses and trees in the years ahead with you.
Yes, and as far as I'm concerned, having published one paper on it is just the beginning. So it's not like having published this particular paper with its particular scope and perspective excludes deepening it. I think that the deepening is the whole possibility right now. So I look forward to deepening it with you. And yes, thanks for the wonderful discussion. To listeners, please like, subscribe, and share. Admittedly, this particular podcast has been a little bit, shall we say, deep and technical, in the sense that not everybody is steeped in the sort of details of nutrition and plant physiology, but we try to cover a wide variety of topics. And until we see you again, over and out from us.
Ciao.